You're listening to the Talking Headways Podcast Network. This is Talking Headways, a weekly podcast about sustainable transportation and urban design. I'm Jeff Wood. This week we're joined by author Paris Marx to talk about their book, Road to Nowhere, What Silicon Valley Gets Wrong About the Future of Transportation. We talk about technologists and the stories they tell themselves, Ursula Guin's carrier bag theory, and Uber's impact on labor laws. Stay with us. Today's podcast is brought to you by our super generous Patreon supporters. Thanks for supporting each month. We really appreciate it. To join this merry band of zoning nerds and infrastructure wizards, go to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. $2 a month gets you some stickers and a handwritten note. $10 a month gets you one of our transportation scarves. Heavy knit bus or bike only, or lightweight bike only with fading checkerboard design. Sign up at patreon.com/theoverheadwire and I'll send one right along. You can also purchase the scarves at theoverheadwire.com. Get your fresh Elmo or fresh Kermit before winter arrives. Order now at theoverheadwire.com. Also, because we do a lot of episodes covering a lot of books, we've partnered with bookshop.org as an affiliate. This means that if you buy a book through the Overhead Wire shop on Bookshop, a small amount of that purchase goes to us. Now, we love when you order from your local bookstores, but if you want to support the authors we have on the show and help keep us interviewing them, that would be tremendous. All the books we've ever discussed on the show with the authors are now in the shop. That's bookshop.org/shop/theoverheadwire. That's bookshop.org/shop/theoverheadwire. And finally, check out the Overhead Wire Daily Newsletter, established in 2006. We were doing it way before anyone else thought it was cool. Join thousands of readers and sign up for a 2-week trial at theoverheadwire.com to check it out. That's a 2-week free trial at theoverheadwire.com. Paris Marx, welcome to the Talking Headways podcast.
Thanks so much for having me. Very excited to chat with you.
Well, thanks for being here. Before we get started, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. My name is Paris Marx, as you've just said. I'm the host of the Tech Won't Save Us podcast, another podcast if you're interested in tech issues where we, take a critical look at the tech industry. I'm also the author of Road to Nowhere, What Silicon Valley Gets Wrong About the Future of Transportation. And I write a lot about the tech industry, climate change, some other topics for a whole load of different publications.
So how did you first start getting interested in cities and in kind of thinking about cities and especially about this connection between technology and what's going on in cities as well?
Yeah, it's a good question. I started writing about these issues back around 2015, 2016, and I was interested in what was going on in cities. I was writing a lot about San Francisco, about Uber, about these kind of topics. And I would say part of that came from just developing a more critical perspective on technology over the course of a number of years. But also during that period, I was doing a lot of traveling, taking a break from my bachelor's degree, was doing the not uncommon thing, I guess, of, doing a bit of travel before going back to school and whatnot, a bit of a late gap year, I guess. And, just thinking about, I come from a place that's very car-centric, car-oriented. The transit system is not very good. And just seeing how different cities were operating, how things worked in different ways in different places, getting to actually use efficient transit systems for the first time really in my life and seeing how different that was. And then, reflecting on that when I got back to a car-oriented place once again. And in that moment, of course, as those things were happening, there were also the conversations around Uber were escalating in that moment, and some of these other tech companies and smart cities were certainly a big topic in that period. And so then I think kind of bringing together those interests in cities along with that interest in transportation in that moment naturally led me into thinking a bit more and writing a bit more about these issues. And then I later pursued a master's degree looking at what Silicon Valley, has been proposing for transportation.
What's changed since you first started thinking about it and now? I mean, there's been a lot of technology changes, but what's been kind of the biggest change you've seen since you started thinking about these issues?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think the biggest thing would be the change in perspective, I think, on these technologies. Like certainly in that moment in the mid 2010s and a bit earlier, I think we were still in a moment. Certainly there were, kind of dissenting views on some of these technologies. There was some criticism of Uber, but I think we were still at a place where there was a lot of excitement for what these technologies could offer us in cities and what benefits they could bring. And I think certainly in the years that followed that, in 2016, 17, 18 in particular, there was a real turn against some of these technologies and a realization that a lot of the promises that were made about them in the beginning maybe weren't actually realized. And in some cases, they actually made problems that we were dealing with worse rather than making them better.
It's so interesting because it feels like, and just from reading the book, it feels like there's an initial kind of excitement, some cheerleading, and then we get to this point where there's a backlash, a techlash, as it were. But this isn't new. I mean, this is something that had happened over 100 years ago as well, and it seems like something that continues to happen, and we tend not to learn from our history.
Yeah, that's unfortunate, I think. But you can certainly see those patterns repeating, right? And that's part of the reason why in the book I did want to go back and look at the history of automobility and dig into what has happened over the past 100 years rather than just the past decade and a half, right? Because taking that longer view, seeing the rollout of the automobile, but also the proposal of things like self-driving cars and electric vehicles and how taxi regulations have evolved over time, you really see how there are a lot of promises made in different periods and they're not always followed through on, or there are technological promises that are presented to people and they're not realized and then they come back a few decades later. And so I think that there's a bit of a cycle going on here and we seem to be in the midst of yet another cycle and we can see what will actually come out of it, or and what promises will be lost again and might come back again in a few decades time. But yeah, I think the history is really important to informing that and just looking beyond, say, the past decade or two and really seeing that there's a much longer history here and that what we've been presented over that past couple decades is really shaped by what has happened before that as well.
It's interesting too, because the folks that you talk about in the book, these founders, the technologists, they tend to weave these fantastic tales about how their technology can change the future. But we've had these tales before, like you mentioned. I mean, the one that stands out to me that I hadn't known. I mean, I understand a lot of the history of the streetcar and all those things, but I hadn't thought about the jitneys necessarily, the Los Angeles jitneys. And so Travis Kalanick's kind of wayback machine on his own to the jitney is a different story than the actual story. And so, the tales that they weave are interesting too.
Absolutely. I think when we think about Silicon Valley, one of the things that stands out to me is how they think about history and how they position history and the way that they tell their own history, right? There's a real desire to present a particular narrative to the public about the industry itself and about the technologies that they are presenting to the world, right? A narrative that really serves them, a narrative that focuses on the entrepreneur, that focuses on the market, that focuses on the role that technology plays in, fomenting changes in society, really downplays other social forces, really downplays the role of the government and the state in these sorts of things. And so, when Travis Kalanick starts to talk about the jitneys, it's so interesting, right? Because he's presenting this story in a way that particularly suits Uber, right? That provides a historical precedent for Uber. So we can say, oh, this is not a completely new thing. We can see how it fits into the past and we could have had this better future, but we can have it today because the way he tells the story is very much like there was this moment in the early 1900s as the automobile was emerging. There were these services that emerged to challenge the dominance of the streetcar companies, right? Because they had this control over the street. And, these people started their own little services. They were able to get around, but then they were crushed by the power of these streetcar companies and by the power of the government, right? Fitting into these libertarian narratives that are really focused around Uber. But then when you go back and actually look at what was happening in that moment, people were starting these services because there was an economic downturn and they needed a way to make some money, right? And in many cases, these services didn't actually make very much money, which is something that is very resonant with the story of Uber. But they also, by taking passengers away from the streetcars, started to have some negative effects. Certainly there were crashes. More people died because of these cars. They were, going pretty fast. They were speeding on the roads. But the streetcars also had agreements with the city, right? They had contracts with the city. And so they needed to pay a certain amount in tax. In many cases, they needed to ensure that the road was paved. Sometimes that street lighting was provided. There were things written into the contract that they had to provide. They provided a material benefit, right? And so then when you see passengers start to go away and go toward these jitneys, that puts the streetcar at risk. And it also puts these benefits that come from the streetcar at risk. So it's only natural that the government step in and say, okay, we need to regulate these new services. We need to ensure that they're paying tax, that they're providing some benefits. And because they were so just on the line, right, not really making any money, they couldn't hold up and they went away, which I think is only natural. And then later we get real taxi services and proper taxi regulations to come in there. But it shows how, you're not crushing these things because they're challenging a dominant power or something like that, but rather there's a recognition that they're not providing the social benefits that they should be providing. In many ways, they're creating harms. And so if they're not able to survive, they're just going to go out of existence. And just to close this point, Travis Kalanick says in telling the story that it was an opportunity for a different future, right? Had they not been wiped out, the future of mobility would have been one of shared automobility rather than personal ownership. But that doesn't really fit with the story that he's telling, because if, as he's telling it, there was all this power from the streetcar monopoly and they crushed the jitneys, then you'd imagine that we'd still be taking streetcars everywhere now. But that's not the case because, there were larger forces at play here.
It also kind of benefits the, at the time, nascent auto industry and the peripherals, right? The oil companies and all that. And so it's interesting to see that those same themes also translate to today as well, with people like Elon Musk, who is not my favorite person to talk about, obviously, but there's an undertone of trying to wipe out everything in its wake on its way to selling Teslas.
Absolutely. I think it's so interesting to go back to that period where the automobile is emerging and to kind of compare it to today, right? Because we get these narratives from the tech companies and especially these ones who are involved in transportation that they are disrupting the status quo, right? That they're disruptors, that they're really changing things. But I think when you actually look at the effect that they're having, it's often just to put digital technologies or other new technologies in the existing system, but not actually to change anything very fundamental. Whereas when we go back to the emergence of the automobile, there's this new technology and there's a major kind of social and economic and kind of structural transformation that takes place because of that technology. And when we look at why that occurs, it's not because the automobile emerges and it's just natural that it takes over the street, that it changes the social norms that exist, that it pushes everyone else off of the street, but rather there is a really kind of strong and powerful lobby group, the automakers, their suppliers, the oil companies, construction companies, and other interests that are going to benefit from automobility that are behind this product that lobby the government in order to change regulations, in order to put in place subsidies, in order to really alter the way that transportation works and the way that communities are built to enforce car dependence on the public, really. And so it's not simply because a technology exists that it kind of takes over and changes the landscape and quote unquote disrupts things, but rather because there are particular interests behind it and that they are able to get the government to act in their favor to change the way that we all live in a way that's going to allow them to make profits. And so now when we look at what's happening today, Elon Musk is pushing particular ideas. And I would say that, one of his impacts is really to halt an attempt for us to move away from the automobile, right? From the dominance of the automobile. Every time that there are opportunities for us to move away from, or anytime there are opportunities for us to invest in transit, to invest in cycling, things like that, often Elon Musk emerges to say, instead of transit, how about we do autonomous cars? And they'll be around in a few years' time, and then they don't arrive, but we've got in the way of making those transit investments, as happened in Nashville and some other places. Or he says, okay, we're not going to do transit, but let's do Boring Company. Let's do these tunnels that are going to solve traffic congestion. So we don't need subways. We'll just have tunnels for cars instead. Or, oh, okay, the government in California is going to invest in high-speed rail. Instead, here's a hyperloop that we should do instead because high-speed rail is old technology. And so every single time he comes in to try to disrupt these attempts to provide people alternatives to the car, meanwhile, he's an automaker who's selling this idea that the electric car is all that we need to solve the problems of the automobile's contribution to climate change, when I think it's a bit bigger than that.
Over the last few days, you posted a tweet about Elon Musk's blatant, basically, admission that he was trying to kill high-speed rail in his biographer. And there's been a big response on Twitter. I'm curious what you think about that. You originally tweeted about this in 2019, even maybe before that. And so I kind of went back and I saw where it originally came from because I wanted to read the text. But it's interesting to see kind of the blow up of that one admission after these articles from, I think it was Gizmodo and also your Time article talking about this admission. And it's interesting. What's been the response to that kind of understanding?
Yeah, it's really fascinating to me because this is an admission that was made in a book that was published in 2015 and then obviously reissued, I think, in 2017, because it was obviously a very popular book, the first real biography of Elon Musk. And it was a very fawning kind of portrayal of him, I would say. And so, yeah, I tweeted about it in 2019. In that moment, it also got a bit of attention, but not anything near the attention that it's received now in 2022. And, I think that there are probably a few things to think about it, but I think the biggest one is probably that it illustrates how the mood has really shifted about Elon Musk over that period. Like there have always been, since the Hyperloop was announced in 2013, people saying that this is a joke, that it's not real, that it's vaporware, basically, right? People who recognize that it was about trying to disrupt California high-speed rail. And certainly the admission is made or is published in 2015. He probably told that to his biographer before that. But in that moment, Elon Musk still had a much stronger hold, I think, on the public's imagination and was still revered in a way that he is not today, right? I think that especially in the past few years, we've seen a real shift in how the public sees Elon Musk. Certainly, there are a lot of people who still see him positively. Still has a very kind of dedicated cult following. But I think that there's a lot of other people who are really turning on him and seeing him more as the kind of hostile, belligerent billionaire that he is, who is having a lot of negative impacts and who is possibly leading us astray in many ways. Certainly, I would argue that. And I think that the fact this is blowing up now really illustrates the degree to which a lot more people feel that way. And a lot of people are really fed up with Elon Musk, but even more than that, these billionaires and the power that they hold in our societies to shape our societies. And I think that this example, we can question the degree to which it actually worked to put California high-speed rail off the track. I think that there are plenty of problems with that project, that stem from many different places. But yeah, I think people are a bit fed up with Elon Musk and with the idea that billionaires can wield so much power over our society and over us.
What was the initial kind of thinking to put together the book? I mean, like you've had all these ideas, I'm sure, and you've started thinking about them, and then wanted to probably have them coalesce into a single narrative. I'm curious, like, what was the impetus for thinking about that initial single narrative?
Yeah, so as I said, I've been writing about these issues for 5, 6, 7 years, whatever it is now, and I started a master's in 2018 because I wanted to dig into this further. I wanted to understand it further, do a bit more research on it, right? So I did a master's in urban geography, looking at what the tech industry has proposed for the future of transportation and whether those ideas would actually benefit the public, would actually solve the problems that we need to solve in the transportation system as a result of our over reliance on automobiles, right? And so once I finished my master's in 2020, people had already mentioned to me that I should consider turning it into a book. And there have been books on these topics before, but often those books focused on a particular company, right? Like Ed Niedermeyer's book Ludicrous, which is fantastic and looks at Tesla, Mike Isaac's Super Pumped, which looks at Uber. These are really great books, right? And there are many others that really dig into these companies. But I didn't feel that there was one that really kind of stepped back and took a broader look at the space and the ideas more broadly that they were putting forward to offer a more, I guess, complete critique of their ideas for the future of transportation. And so I had a lot of respect for Verso. I read a lot of their books. Some of my friends were published there. So they connected me with Leo Hollis, who's my editor at Verso. And they were immediately really interested in the book. And so, yeah, I decided to move forward with it.
It's interesting to think about kind of the process for putting these books together and the amount of work that you have to do, the amount of reading that you have to do. It feels like there's probably books that you read you didn't like, that you were frustrated with, that you had to anyways because you were putting together, trying to be comprehensive about your research.
Yeah, the Elon Musk biography was definitely one of those. And if people do check out the tweet that I did in 2019, that was part of a thread that I made while I was reading through the book. And it's very apparent that I did not enjoy that book.
I think at the end you were like, I am done with this.
Yeah. It was like 1 star, like, this is terrible. Don't read it yourself or something like that. There's certainly a lot of things that I've read over those years that were annoying and that I didn't like. But at the same time, I think that those things also help to inform a real understanding of these people and these companies and what is actually going on in the space, right? Like if you're only reading other criticisms and other critiques, then that's not a good way to fully understand what they are proposing, right? So I've certainly listened to a ton of interviews with Elon Musk as well, watched a ton of presentations that he's given, same with people like Travis Kalanick or, Jeff Bezos or the whole lot of them, right? Because, you kind of do need to see it come from the horse's mouth at the end of the day to actually understand what they're saying and what they're trying to do. And then, to develop a critique around that, certainly by reading what other people are proposing, but also other theories and things to inform what has been happening. And I would say also understanding the history has been important to that too, to seeing what has happened in the past and how that informs what is happening today.
I'm sure you've been talked to a number of people for interviews and things like that for the book so far. What's something that people haven't asked you that you wish you could talk about more?
I feel like one of the parts of the book that I've really enjoyed doing a lot of interviews on the book and seeing what people ask me, right? A lot of people seem to be really fascinated by the history of automobility that I lay out in the book, certainly inspired by the work of people like Peter Norton and many other, academics and historians of the city and transportation. And certainly that's something that I think listeners of this podcast are already quite familiar with, right? But I guess for a lot of the people in tech who I'm talking to, that's not a history that they're as knowledgeable about. And so that's been really fascinating. I would say one of the aspects of the book that maybe people haven't asked me as much about, and I think it's one of my favorite parts of the book, is I believe it's chapter 9, when I dig into a bit of like the science fictional stuff and the work of Ursula K. Le Guin, because I think that is so helpful to reframing how we approach these things and how we approach these technologies and these ideas for society. Because, Ursula K. Le Guin is this just fantastic science fiction author who I think really has a power in her fiction of having us look at the world in a different way by using fiction in this way that enables us to do it, right? Especially a book like The Dispossessed, which is one of my favorites, which kind of contrasts these two societies, one like anarchist society against the capitalist society, and has like a member of the anarchist society go visit the other and kind of see it through his eyes. And it's just so fascinating. But one of the ways that is important to transportation is that Le Guin was also quite critical of the car in her writing. She wrote a short story, a young adult book about a teenager who doesn't like the car. And I think that there's a lot of it's interesting to see that in the 1970s, which is also a moment when there's a bit of a questioning of this dominance of the car because the oil shocks are in that period. And there's a focus on energy and how we get energy and whether these things make sense. And certainly there's a doubling down on the automobile and suburbia after the 1970s, but in that moment there's kind of an opportunity to rethink it. But she also writes a lot about science fiction and about the way that we think about history, especially when we're thinking about, say, great man narratives and how we think about history progresses and what actually pushes history forward. And also, technology and the role that technology plays in society and how we tend to, when we talk about technology, and I think we can see this with the tech industry as well, we frame technology in a very particular way, right? We don't think about the more mundane things that we're used to be technology. Rather, the word technology in our case today is often meant to mean digital technologies and AI and things like that, right? And so there's a particular framing that I think serves the industry and serves what they want us to think of as technology and as progress. But I think that her work actually really allows us to challenge that and think about it in a different way. And so that was one of my favorite kind of pieces of the book that I don't think people have picked up on as much.
There are two of the quotes that you pulled from her. I think that were really interesting. One was the boy who was not into cars, and his dad gave him a car, and he was like, I don't want this, but I don't know how to say no. And I think that kind of typifies the overall kind of, I want to say, the zeitgeist of living in North America.
Yeah.
Where, and I had this too, where when I was 16, I got to drive my dad's car, and I appreciated it because getting around otherwise in the suburbs, even though it was very bikeable, which I'll probably cover on a future podcast, but it was something that it was kind of a rite of passage. And so, but it's something that's expected, that's part of societal, not indoctrination per se, maybe it is indoctrination, but just kind of like that push. And then the other one was the idea of, like I think you mentioned, the great men theories, and the idea of the knapsack as something that is just as important to civilization as these men. And one of the things that I've been doing is going through Lewis Mumford's book, The City in History. And if you go back early enough in kind of the governance structures of society and history, you have these tribal structures where a group of people will decide on the importance of what's best for the culture and what's best for society. And then at some point it gets to this kind of warmonger society where some individual will become the leader and kind of rule over people like a cult, etc. And that changes, civilization and society from a different perspective. And so it's interesting to see that history and how her kind of discussion of that changes your mental thinking about it when you start to look at that frame differently.
Absolutely. Le Guin comes from a family of anthropologists, right? And anthropologists who worked with indigenous groups in California. And that really influenced a lot of her thinking on a lot of these issues. Like, you can see a lot of her work and her science fiction as kind of anthropological science fiction, right? The way that she thinks about social structures and societies. And that really comes out in that piece you're talking about, where she talks about the carrier bag theory of history, right? This idea that the way that we think about history right now is like the men with their bows and arrows and their spears, and kind of the action that is needed in order to move society forward, when actually, if we think about what is really essential to a healthy society, it's the carrier bag and the gathering activities and things like that. And so she also kind of uses that to talk about technology, because it's something that she's obviously thinking a lot about as a science fiction writer, thinking about the future and things like that, and how, the technologies that, especially in her time, were really promoted were these really kind of high tech, high investment technologies. Things like nuclear energy, for example, would have been really on her radar at the time. I think we could certainly look at the automobile as one of those, whereas, technologies like the bicycle, that is more mundane, or things like that, are kind of put to the side and not even considered technologies on their own. And so, when you bring that in, when you take a wider view of technology and the role of technology and what technology does to society, when you look at the technology in the same light as these other, or sorry, when you look at the bicycle in the same light as these other technologies, how does that change the way that you think about society? How do you think about, how we might build society? And I would say another piece of that is certainly to think about the economic interests around these various technologies. And I think that's really key as well, right? What drives our adoption is things that are going to make money, or enhance particular kinds of control, rather than always what's going to be the best for us as a public and improve the lives that we have.
And that great man narrative kind of gets to another part of the book where you kind of discuss the people who are these heads of the tech industry, who are making, the VCs and all these people who basically are trying to, make something that benefits them, but not necessarily society generally. So I think, you mentioned a number of times is Jarrett Walker's elite projection discussion, which was one of his best blog posts, I think. But thinking about Elon Musk, for example, like him being stuck in traffic, and so he decides that he wants to bury himself under the 405 freeway so he can get to work faster, and then this becomes a solution for everybody.
Yeah, I think you see it time and time again, right? And I think that Jarrett Walker's kind of description of it is so spot on. These people who have their own experience of things, and then just assume that everyone else's experience is going to reflect theirs, or what works for them is going to work for everybody else. And we see it repeated time and time again, whether it's in transportation or whether it's in these other technologies that are being proposed for people. So we look at a company like Uber that was supposed to reduce traffic congestion and make it easier for people to get around, be complementary to transit and all these other supposed benefits, when really it was an idea that was dreamed up by Travis Kalanick and his buddies in order to make it easier for them to access a taxi. And then a number of years down the line, when academics are really able to look into it, to do some independent research on it, they find that actually, it made traffic worse. It mainly served people who were young, earning above average incomes in cities, who were college educated, not the people who are most in need of, better transportation, better mobility services. The climate contribution was worse. It pulled people from transit. It was not really beneficial to our cities. And all while doing that, it engaged in an attack on the rights of workers and has even rewritten labor legislation in a way that is not only harmful for Uber drivers and taxi drivers, but likely people in other industries as well, as this, extends out. And Elon Musk is another perfect example of this. It's what he thinks is going to be best for society and then kind of pushing that on the rest of us, even when they're really narrow-minded ideas for how transportation should work. And in many cases, if you ask pretty much any expert in transportation, they would tell you that the things he's dreaming up are, in many cases, absolutely ridiculous. The Hyperloop, the Boring Company, all these things like that. And so this is really damaging. And I think it gets to something that we were talking about before, how the role of Elon Musk is really to stifle these attempts to move away from our reliance on automobiles and to give people alternatives, right? To give people something else, another way to get around, because that doesn't work for Elon Musk. It's not something that he personally desires. He calls transit inconvenient. He says that there could be a serial killer on the bus or the subway with you. And so it's not surprising that someone like that is going to oppose efforts to improve transit. But then why are we allowing him to have such influence over transportation policy when we know that he's not an expert on transportation in any way? And so these really naive ideas then shape the policy conversation in a really harmful way.
I think that's a really important point because it feels like a lot of these folks, and sometimes it's good to be from the outside, right? To take a critical look from the outside of something that maybe seems a little bit insular. But all these non-transportation planners, which is fine, but there's something that you say in the book, which is basically they don't take time to understand the real issues before they start kind of popping off their ideas. And the one of the biggest ones that I'm reminded of that kind of just faded and disappeared because it didn't really work was when Y Combinator was like, we're just going to build a new city in the desert somewhere, and it's going to be the best city ever, and we're hiring people to think about it and all this stuff, and then you never hear from them again. But at the time, they took kind of this mastery of cities as if they were the only people that could solve the problem, as if city planners and everybody else hadn't been thinking about this for hundreds of years.
Yeah, and that comes up time and time again, right? Like these proposals for new cities, for better cities, and because we have these technologies, because we have this knowledge from the tech industry, we're going to be able to make something that is so much better, right? Like certainly there's the idea of this city in the desert. There have been other proposals for similar ones. Bill Gates was going to build a smart city of his own. You see existing proposals down in El Salvador. They want to build a city centered around Bitcoin, or their dictator certainly wants to. There have been proposals for these kind of smart cities all over the world. New cities is what they're often called, where countries around the world say that they're going to build a new city that is going to be focused around technology or some other particular sector and try to use that as a way to attract foreign capital to the country. In many cases, these cities are complete failures, never get anywhere, or if they do, they're highly exclusive, they're very expensive, they don't actually benefit the broader public, right? And, we can even look at Google, right? They tried to take over a piece of Toronto until they were forced out by the public because they said, you're not actually thinking about our actual needs in building this city. You're thinking about what's going to work best for you as Google. And you're trying to stick your technologies in one part of the city and then spread them across the rest of the city. And that doesn't work for us. And, in Toronto, they were successful in forcing Google out. And I think that is a positive thing. And so I think we always need to be kind of on guard and thinking about what the effect of these companies and these technologies are going to be, because often what works best for a company's business model doesn't necessarily work best for those of us who are going to be subjected to it down the line.
How much of this is a larger discussion about individualism versus collectivism?
Yeah, that's certainly, a big point of the book, right? One of the things that I draw on is how a lot of these ideas that drive the way that we think about technology now do really come out of these individual ideas, whether it's around the counterculture in the 1970s and how that influences the ideas of Silicon Valley, but also how that's found in neoliberal ideas in the 1980s and how they kind of get woven together to form a kind of ideology of the Valley, right? There's a strong libertarianism in Silicon Valley that's very focused on the individual and empowering the individual, and that's very hostile to government and state power, I guess, in a sense, right? And I think that has really served us poorly. If we think about what we have seen from the tech industry over the past several decades, there has been this real focus, especially among some of like the more optimistic folks in the tech industry, people who are promoting these narratives back in the 90s and the 80s, that technology was going to empower the individual, was going to liberate the individual, and that it was going to be a counterforce to the government, which was this kind of oppressive power, right? And this was certainly pulling from neoliberal ideas in the 80s, where the idea was we needed small government to get government out of our lives and things like that. And I think that served us poorly because it did not then take the critical stance that was necessary toward corporations and corporate power. And so instead, what we saw was this real desire to keep the state out of regulation of technology or the internet or what have you. And that enabled the kind of growth of the tech industry as we have it today and the monopolistic issues that we're dealing with now, where these business models were basically able to run amok, were treated as though they were inherently positive because technology is associated with progress. And now, a couple decades down the line, we're having to clean up the mess that was created as a result. And I think that we're recognizing that actually there does need to be a role for government in there, and that we do need to think about the collective impact of these things, right? And that actually dealing with many of these problems that we're facing, and bringing it back to transportation, does require thinking more collectively, not just about each one of us as an individual driving our individual automobile, but if we're actually going to deal with problems like traffic or the deaths that are caused by our reliance on automobiles, or even the climate impact of the transportation system, that's going to require a greater investment in collective solutions. And that investment does ultimately have to come from the state and from our governments in order to make public transit actually work for people.
One of the arguments you make in the book is that reformers and advocates like Jane Jacobs and Ralph Nader didn't go far enough to achieve their goals. What do you think they missed by just kind of scratching the surface of the automobile and not kind of pushing further, maybe like some of the other countries like the Netherlands did after the oil crisis?
Yeah, I was a bit hesitant to actually put that in the book because I was worried that people might see it in like a negative sense or the wrong sense, right? Because I do think that they did really positive things, right? In fighting against highways, in trying to ensure that vehicles were safer. But ultimately, they didn't take on the commercial power of these industries, right? And so while vehicles were made safer and while some segments of highway were defeated, ultimately the system kept expanding through the 80s and the 90s and the 2000s, right? And the reliance on the automobile deepened in a really harmful way. And so I think today we can certainly look back at those struggles that they waged and learn from them, because I think that there's a lot that we can learn from them and that we need to learn from them in order to take on the problems in our transportation system and the interests that have ensured that those problems persist. But, for example, Ralph Nader has been speaking out recently about autonomous driving technologies and about Tesla's full self-drive technology in particular. He came out the other day saying that the regulator should recall it. And I think that that's a really positive intervention. But I think that when we think about what we need to do to take on the car in the future, it does need to go beyond ensuring that the car is safer, right? We actually need to take on the car itself and its dominant place in society. And as you're saying, I think that we can look to some of those examples from Europe for ways that might work in order to do that, because they were more successful in the 1970s in taking on, at that moment, what was the beginnings of a transformation in order to entrench the car, particularly in places like the Netherlands and Copenhagen, in pushing back against the deaths that were being caused by the car, but also how it was transforming communities, how it was expensive, how it didn't fit with what they were used to, and they were able to achieve a transportation policy that was more focused around bicycles. And that's not to say that they don't have cars in the Netherlands. They certainly do. They have suburbs as well, but not to the same kind of degree. And they have more cycling infrastructure so that, people can actually get around in other ways, especially in, cities and things like that. The other point I would make on that front is just to say that we are in this period right now where we do have the opportunity to seize those things to try to make these changes, right? We're not only in this moment where the climate crisis is increasingly apparent, and we know that we need to do something in order to reduce our emissions. And part of that has to do with the transportation system because it's such a huge contributor to emissions. And so I think electric cars are not enough in that sense. And what we really need to do is ensure that we're getting as many people out of cars as possible. And so that needs to be a key focus. But we're also in this moment where gas prices are really high and where deaths caused by automobiles, where road deaths are soaring in the United States. And so there are many different kind of things that can be seized on in order to try to make this argument against the car and for greater investment in public transit and also cycling infrastructure like dedicated lanes, street space, parking facilities so that people won't feel that their bike is going to get stolen if they park it somewhere, to actually encourage this shift away from the automobile that I think is really necessary.
In your solutions at the end of the book, you talk about Paris and thinking not just about like regulations, because you're not a fan of things like congestion pricing, for example, but actually changing the landscape so that it makes it harder for cars overall. I think that's an interesting perspective. I'm wondering if you can kind of expand on that.
Absolutely. So I see congestion pricing as kind of a market mechanism, right? A market-oriented solution to the problem. And I don't think that that actually gets to the root of the problem, which is, the distribution of space in the city, and how we prioritize our investment. And so I think that, you can see in some cities where congestion pricing has worked. I think you can look at other cities where it hasn't been so effective. And often in the places where it has been effective, it's been combined with more structural measures in order to change the distribution of street space. But then you can look at other cities like Paris or Oslo, where these measures were taken without congestion pricing, and they had similar successful results. And so I would prefer more of an approach that focuses on the distribution of space in the streets, so that actually takes space away from cars, and that gives more space to transit or to cycling or to pedestrians and what have you, to encourage those shifts. Because one of the things that we know from transportation is that, as much as Elon Musk would say it doesn't exist, induced demand is a real thing. And so if we do start to make those kind of material changes to the way that the city is constructed, I think you do start to encourage other ways of getting around. Whereas I think that the congestion pricing approach, and the pricing approach in particular, can sometimes hurt or hit, the people who can least afford to pay more. And we can see reactions against those sorts of things with like the Gilets jaunes protests in France a number of years ago. And I think we can see them increasingly. There's growing pushback to automotive policies and things like that in the UK as well, and to pricing mechanisms. Here in Canada, we can see opposition to carbon pricing, for example. And I don't think that carbon pricing is inherently a very effective means of actually producing climate action. And so I think ultimately what we need is stronger action by our governments to actually make these things happen, instead of hoping that by tweaking some pricing that the market will do these things on their own. And I really don't think we have time to wait for that.
You spoke earlier about kind of corporate power versus government power. And when I was reading a book and then got towards the end, I was thinking to myself, in terms of Uber, what's been more damaging? Has it been the labor problems that have been more damaging, or the transportation problems? And I guess it's not really, it's not really pitting them against each other necessarily, but I'm wondering which one is going to have the most long-term impact, because maybe the transportation will kind of get fixed eventually as Uber and Lyft disappear or fold back into a taxi-like organization, whereas the labor stuff seems to be more impactful overall.
Yeah, I think we're already starting to see that former point already happen. The move back into a more taxi-like structure. We can see Uber making deals with taxi companies in New York City, in San Francisco, in Italy, for example, in order to bring taxis onto the app. And I think that there are problems there as well, especially if Uber is the one that now sets the rules for how taxis work. But I do think that the longer term impacts are absolutely the labor effects, right? Especially in the places where Uber is successfully rewriting labor law, like in California, in order to carve out a third category of worker. And we've already seen other businesses seek to reclassify their workers along those lines. And so Uber is still waging this campaign today. In Canada, where I am, they're still trying to get what's called Flexible Work Plus implemented up here, and they're pushing on the government of Ontario in particular to do that. Over in the UK, there was the Supreme Court ruling last year on the rights of the workers, saying that they're not independent contractors, but workers. And specifically in that ruling, the Supreme Court said that they should be paid from log on to log off, a minimum wage. But Uber ignored that particular aspect of the ruling because it doesn't want to treat workers in that way. And so now they're going to have to sue again to get Uber to actually reflect that. And this is a war that they're waging in other countries as well. And so I think that that is also is ultimately, even if Uber is never profitable, even if it fades away in a couple of years because it's proven that it's never going to be a workable business, and because of higher interest rates, it can't get the cheap money that it used to, those labor impacts are going to stick around for a really long time. And I think that's the most troubling thing there.
I think that's an interesting point that all of this money was sunk into giving people free rides, and the benefit to the VCs and the people who with capital is that eventually the whole system of labor is changing. It's not necessarily even the transportation issue that comes about. It's something completely different. And I think that's fascinating that you can kind of mess with something on the right hand and then the left hand kind of comes around the other side and takes it.
Yeah, one of the things that Hubert Horan, who's a longtime critic of Uber, who's worked in transportation for decades, really pointed out was that, there was an effort in the 1990s to further deregulate the taxi industry by, funded by the Kochs and really pushed by a lot of libertarian groups. That was unsuccessful largely. That didn't achieve its aims. But then when Uber was making its push, it picked up a lot of that playbook that was developed in the 90s and used it for its push to deregulate the taxi industry and ultimately to take on workers' rights. And so obviously, I think that that's going to be the longer term impact of that. And it's a really harmful impact. And you can see how it's connected to larger desires of capital to change the relationship with workers. But I would also say, even if Uber doesn't work, as you're saying, this is something that they will always have as a benefit, even if the Uber model collapses. But those investors also profited as well, even though Uber lost billions of dollars, because when Uber IPO'd, they were able to cash out and they bought in at a really low price, right? And so they really left kind of retail investors and some others holding the bag on that. But a lot of the early investors both profited and have benefited from this reclassification and rewriting of labor law.
What's been the response to the book so far? Have you gotten any feedback from folks or thinking along the lines of positive or negative towards what your thesis is?
I would say a lot of what I've heard is positive, which is good, and certainly the book does seem to be getting a lot more attention in this moment. I think there was attention since it launched, but I think that attention is broadening out in the past couple of weeks to an even wider audience, which is fantastic to see. I think that there's a lot of interest, as I was saying, especially from the tech folks, in the kind of urban historical angle to this. And I think that it also comes out in a moment when there is a desire to reassess some of these ideas around transportation and reassess Elon Musk as a figure who is delivering us many of these ideas about transportation. One kind of critical note that I've had about it is on my presentation of micromobility, in particular the dockless bike and scooter services, which is something that I am critical of in the book. I guess the feedback that I got on it was that, maybe we should accept that there are some positive things that the tech industry has done. Maybe I'm a bit overly critical, but I would say that I think on the micromobility question, and I think this is certainly relevant to some of your listeners as well. I think the real problem there is not, obviously bikes and scooters in cities, which is something that I really like. And I think that we can certainly have, docked and shared services that can work. But the problem is really that many of these services had a ton of venture capital. And so when they entered cities, they were not really concerned with what the communities needed and what the cities actually needed in order to enable better active mobility and to help people move away from cars. They were concerned about their own business goals, right? And taking over and reaching as many cities as possible, and didn't consider the wider impacts of what they were doing. And so now we're in a moment where those services are finding that they've lost the cheap money, that their share prices are plummeting. And I think that this means that now cities, in many cases, have an opportunity to step back in and to say, okay, if we're going to let these services operate, you need to actually do some consultations. You need to actually know what the community needs. And if we're going to continue to have one of these shared services in the city, it needs to actually serve our goals and our needs, not the needs of your business.
The book is The Road to Nowhere: What Silicon Valley Gets Wrong About the Future of Transportation. Where can folks find it if they want to get a copy?
Anywhere. It's available from all the major booksellers. You can certainly ask your local bookstore if they can bring it in for you. I know right now Verso Books has it 20% off if you want to get a discount from the publisher directly. Yeah, it's all over the place.
Awesome. And where can folks find you if you want to be found on the internet?
Yeah, they can certainly find me on Twitter, where I probably tweet a bit too much under at Paris Marx. And, you know, if they're interested in more critical perspectives on the tech industry, I also host a podcast called Tech Won't Save Us. That's at Tech Won't Save Us on Twitter, or you can find it anywhere. You know, I'm sure anywhere they find your podcast, they can also find mine.
Probably so. Awesome. Well, Paris, thanks for joining us. We really appreciate your time.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for having me on the show.
And thanks for joining us. The Talking Headways podcast is a project of The Overhead Wire and published first at Streetsblog USA. Thanks to our wonderful Patreon supporters for sponsoring this week's show and Mondays at The Overhead Wire. Find us at patreon.com/theoverheadwire. And you can sign up for our 16-year-old newsletter at theoverheadwire.com. And you can also listen to our show on your podcatcher of choice, including Spotify, Stitcher, SoundCloud, iHeartRadio, and Apple Podcasts. And if you can't find it there, you can always find its original home at usa.streetsblog.org. We'll see you next time at Talking Headways.